Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey, being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. Welcome to episode 37 of my historical travel podcast Voyage to go History, where I take you on some of the most daring journeys from the past, expeditions that still shape how we see the world today. In the true story I'm telling, 17-year-old German Georg Forster sails around the world with his father, a naturalist, in the 18th century aboard the HMS Resolution under Captain James Cook. Georg's account is written in the style of his time, so I have translated it into modern English. His knowledge reflects the late 18th century, and along the way, I'll step in to provide historical context and additional background. What happened in the last episode?
In the vast South Pacific at 49 degrees south, the endless cold voyage had tested everyone's endurance. Maheen, the Tahitian passenger, distracted himself by stripping red feathers from his dance aprons while the officers practiced Tahitian with him. From mid-December onward, the ship pressed south, battling fog, icebergs, and bitter wet cold. Doves and songbirds from warmer islands died in the chill. Georg Forster's father fell seriously ill with rheumatism. Christmas brought rum, pudding, and 90 surrounding icebergs, celebrations undampened by danger. Twice they crossed the Antarctic Circle, venturing as far as 71 degrees 10 minutes south before an immense ice field forced them to turn back. On the northward run, Cook, pale and sickly, suffered from constipation while scurvy symptoms spread among the crew. By late February, albatrosses had vanished. Tropical signs returned and easterly winds brought warmer weather. Yet, illness was rampant. Cook slowly recovered under the surgeon's care, but the surgeon himself collapsed from exhaustion. Georg's own health declined with severe scurvy. In early March, calms left them adrift under a hot sun, every man longing for land and relief. The episode ended in tense anticipation of the first sight of shore.
Saturday, March 6th, 1774, South Pacific Ocean, near 30 degrees south.
During the night of March 5th, they saw high clouds and haze on the southern horizon. They hoped this would signal good wind. Indeed, the first rainfall on the morning of the 6th brought fresh wind from the southeast. With sails set, they quickly picked up speed. The next morning, they caught 4 large albacore, the smallest weighing 10 kilograms. After more than 3 months without fresh fish, it was a welcome feast. On March 8th, by noon, they had reached 27 degrees south latitude and now headed west in search of Easter Island. The island had been discovered in 1722 by Jacob Roggeveen and visited in 1770 by the Spanish, who called it San Carlos. On March 10th, numerous gray noddies circled the ship. They were making 7 knots per hour, but lay to at night to avoid hitting the island in the dark. On the morning of March 11th, they finally sighted land. The joy was indescribable. They had not seen land for 103 days. The hardships of the southern latitudes, the stormy nights among dangerous ice masses, the constant changes in climate, and the poor food had drained the entire crew. At the sight of the island, new hope awakened. Everyone looked forward to the chickens and fruits Roggeveen had described. Approaching the coast was slow. The island appeared moderately high, with gentle rises sloping toward the sea. It didn't seem large, but from a distance it was impossible to judge whether it was fertile. The next morning, there was a calm. They were about 9 kilometers from land. The island appeared dark and unwelcoming. Out of boredom, they caught sharks that hungrily snapped at the bait. In the afternoon, wind picked up, and they steered toward the coast, hoping to anchor before nightfall. But even up close, the island looked barren. There was little greenery to be seen. Still, the sight of land was welcome, even if it had been a bare rock. In addition to 2 hills, they saw black pillars standing in groups. They resembled the idol statues described by Roggeveen, but the crew assumed they were tomb monuments, known in the South Seas as E.T. The wind was weak and unfavorable. Night fell, and they found no anchorage on the eastern side of the island, so they had to spend another night under sail. As darkness set in, they saw fires near the pillars. The Dutch had interpreted this as idol worship, but it was more likely that the inhabitants were simply preparing their food. That night, they tacked back and forth to stay close to the island. In the morning, they intended to find a suitable anchorage. They marveled at the excellent instruments they had for determining geographical longitude. Thanks to these tools, they had found the island directly without much searching. Other navigators like Barren, Carteret, and Bougainville had missed it, despite starting from closer points such as Juan Fernandez. Carteret likely failed due to incorrect latitude data in his charts. For Barren and Bougainville, there was no clear explanation. They were especially impressed by the 2 chronometers on board. One had been built by Mr. Kendall based on the Harrison model. The other was a design by Mr. Arnold. Both had run with remarkable precision. However, Arnold's chronometer had stopped functioning shortly after their departure from New Zealand in June 1773. Kendall's continued working until their return to England and received great praise. Nonetheless, precise lunar observations remained more reliable for determining longitude on long voyages, as the mechanics of the clocks were prone to failure. The method of determining geographical longitude from the distances between the sun, moon, and stars was considered one of the most significant discoveries for navigation. Tobias Meyer, a German professor from Göttingen, had undertaken the laborious task of calculating the lunar tables for the first time. His heirs received a reward from the British Parliament. Building on his work, further calculations had improved the method to the point that it became the most accurate means of determining longitude.
In the 18th century, determining a ship's longitude at sea was one of the greatest challenges in navigation. Latitude could be measured relatively easily by observing the height of the sun or certain stars above the horizon. But longitude required knowing the exact difference in time between the ship's current position and a fixed reference point, usually the port of departure or the Greenwich meridian. This was where chronometers came in. A chronometer was a highly precise clock designed to keep time accurately despite the constant motion, temperature changes, and humidity aboard a ship. By comparing the chronometer's time with the local time determined by celestial observations, navigators could calculate how far east or west they had traveled. However, in early years, chronometers were delicate and prone to failure on long voyages. The example from Cook's second voyage shows this clearly. Arnold's chronometer stopped working shortly after leaving New Zealand in June 1773, while Kendall's kept running until their return to England, earning much praise. Even so, many navigators still relied on the method of lunar distances. This involved measuring the angle between the moon and a given star, then using astronomical tables to determine the time at Greenwich. While more laborious, this method could not be disrupted by mechanical failure and often proved more reliable over long journeys.
The latitude measurement of Easter Island matched Admiral Roggevine's figures almost exactly, with a deviation of only 1 to 2 minutes. The longitude in his journal was off by just 1 degree. According to their own measurements, the island lay at 109 degrees and 46 minutes west of Greenwich. The Spanish data for latitude were also accurate, but their longitude was off by about 56 kilometers.
Sunday, March 13th, 1774, Easter Island, Rapa Nui.
In the early morning, their ship, HMS Resolution, sailed close under the southern tip of the island. In that area, the coastline rose steeply from the sea. It consisted of broken rocks, their porous and black iron-colored substance appearing volcanic in origin. 2 isolated rocks lay about 460 meters out in the water from this tip. One of them had a peculiar shape resembling a tall pointed column or an obelisk. Both rocks were inhabited by a vast number of seabirds whose deafening cries filled the air. Soon after, they spotted another headland about 18 kilometers from the first. There, the land sloped more gently toward the shore. In that region, they observed some cultivated fields. Still, the island as a whole appeared barren and infertile. So few fields were visible that they could hardly hope for any substantial amount of fresh provisions, yet their eyes remained fixed on the land. At the same time, they saw many nearly naked people hurrying down from the hills toward the coast. As far as they could tell, the people were unarmed, which was taken as a sign of peaceful intentions. Shortly thereafter, the islanders pushed a canoe into the water. 2 of them paddled quickly toward the ship and reached it in a short time. They called out for a rope to be thrown down to them, using a word similar to the Tahitian term. As soon as the rope was lowered, they tied a large bundle of ripe bananas to it and gestured for it to be pulled up again. The unexpected joy over the fruit was indescribable. Only those as exhausted as they were at the time could truly understand it. More than 50 people began speaking to the men in the canoe at once, who, understandably, could respond to no one. Captain Cook tied glass beads and medals to several ribbons and sent them down in return. The islanders admired these trinkets greatly, but immediately paddled back to shore. As they circled the ship and noticed a fishing line hanging off the stern, they tied a small piece of cloth to it as a farewell. Upon pulling it up, the crew saw it was made from tree bark, dyed yellow, much like on Tahiti. From the few words they had heard, the language seemed to be a dialect of Tahitian. Apparently, the same language was spoken at both ends of the South Pacific. The people resembled the Tahitians, though they were slimmer and of medium height. One of the men in the canoe had a beard trimmed to half a centimeter, while the other was a young man of about 17. They bore the same body markings as the New Zealanders and the inhabitants of the Society and Friendly Islands, but they went entirely naked. The most striking feature was their unusually large earlobes, so stretched that they nearly touched their shoulders, with holes wide enough to fit 4 or 5 fingers. This matched exactly the description given by Roggeveen in his travel journal. Their canoe was also highly unusual. The islanders' boat was constructed from small wooden pieces. Each has a roughly 10 to 12 centimeters wide and 90 to 120 centimeters long. The pieces were intricately assembled. The entire vessel measured about 3 to 3.6 meters in length. The bow and stern rose sharply, while the middle of the canoe sat very low. It had an outrigger or balancer made from 3 thin poles. Each islander used a paddle, the blade of which was also made from separate pieces joined together. This detail, too, had been noted in the reports of Roggeveen's 1722 Voyage, published in Dordrecht in 1728. The frugal use of wood suggested that timber must be scarce on the island, although other travel accounts claimed the opposite.
In 1721, the Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen set sail on a major voyage into the South Seas. His mission, commissioned by the Dutch West India Company, was to search for the legendary Terra Australis, an unknown southern continent believed to balance the lands on the northern hemisphere. Roggeveen commanded 3 ships, navigating from the Netherlands across the Atlantic, around Cape Horn, and into the vast Pacific Ocean. During his journey in April 1722, he made one of his most famous discoveries, Easter Island, known to its inhabitants as Rapa Nui. The sight of its giant stone statues, the Moai, astonished the crew, as no other European had recorded such monuments before. Roggeveen's men went ashore, made contact with the islanders, and noted many details about their appearance, customs, and environment. Some of these observations, such as aspects of clothing, tools, and dwellings, were so distinctive that they would later be compared with accounts from other Pacific voyages. Roggeveen continued westward after leaving Easter Island, visiting other islands in Polynesia before eventually returning to the Dutch East Indies. His voyage contributed valuable early descriptions of the South Seas and opened a new chapter in Europe's awareness of the Pacific world.
Despite having found an anchorage opposite the spot where the canoe had launched, they continued sailing along the coast. They hoped to find better holding ground and proceeded all the way to the northern tip of the island. They had seen this part from the opposite side the day before, but the hope of finding a more suitable anchorage there was not fulfilled, so they returned to the previously discovered spot. Along the shore they saw many black columns or pillars. Some of them stood on platforms made of several layers of stone. The tops of the pillars resembled a head and shoulders, though the lower part appeared to be an unshaped block of stone. At the northern end of the island, they found only a few cultivated plots. The terrain there was steeper than in the central parts. It now became clear that not a single tree on the entire island exceeded 3 meters in height. In the afternoon, they launched a boat. The pilot was to go ashore and survey the anchorage from which the canoe had come. As soon as the locals saw the boat moving away from the ship, they gathered on the shore where it was heading. Most of the islanders were naked. Only a few wore cloths in a pale, yellow, almost orange hue which likely indicated higher rank. The crew could now see the people's houses more clearly. They were low but long, highest in the middle and sloping toward the sides, shaped somewhat like an overturned canoe. In the center there was a small door so low that an adult had to stoop to enter. By evening they anchored off the southwestern side of the island. There they found a depth of 73 meters with good gravel ground. Shortly after, the pilot returned from his reconnaissance. He brought one of the islanders aboard. The man had jumped into the boat uninvited as it approached the shore and had expressed a wish to be taken to the ship. He had a chestnut-brown complexion and was of average build, about 1.73 meters tall. His body was notably hairy, especially on the chest. His beard and black hair were thick, and his beard had been trimmed. His earlobes hung almost to his shoulders. His thighs were tattooed with square or checkerboard patterns, a style they had never seen before. His clothing consisted solely of a belt around his waist with a net attached in front that covered nothing. Around his neck he wore a cord holding a bone about 12 centimeters long, shaped like a tongue. He explained that the bone came from a sea creature he called Toha-Ra, a term used the same way in the Tahitian language. To clarify, he also called it Ka, meaning fishbone. As he sat in the boat, he showed clear signs of being cold. The pilot, Mr. Gilbert, gave him a jacket and placed a hat on his head. In this attire, he came aboard the ship. The captain and passengers gave him nails, medals, and strings of glass beads. He asked for the bead strings to be tied around his head. At first, the islander was suspicious and appeared fearful. He asked if they would kill him as an enemy, but after being reassured that he would be treated kindly, he relaxed and felt safe. From then on, he spoke only of dancing. At first, understanding his language proved difficult, but when they asked him the names of body parts, it became clear that he spoke the same dialect as the people of the Society Islands. The names sounded exactly the same. When he didn't understand a word, he would repeat it several times, his expression clearly showing that he didn't know what was meant. As night fell, he signaled that he wanted to sleep and that he was cold. Georg's father gave him a large piece of coarse Tahitian cloth. The man wrapped himself in it and said he was now warm. They brought him to the pilot's cabin, where he lay down on a table and slept very peacefully through the night. Mahine, their Tahitian companion, who was impatient to go ashore, was pleased that the people spoke a language similar to his own. He had already tried several times to speak with the guest, but was repeatedly interrupted by others' questions.
Monday, March 14th, 1774, Easter Island, Rapa Nui.
During the night, the anchor broke loose and the ship drifted away. They had to set sail to return to the previous anchorage. After breakfast, the captain went ashore together with the islander, Mahine, Georg's father, Sparman, and Georg himself. Georg's legs and thighs were so badly swollen that he could barely walk. Along the coast, they found a good bay, deep enough for boats and protected by cliffs from the heavy waves that crashed violently onto the shore in other parts of the island. Around 100 to 150 islanders had gathered in the area. Most of them were naked, though some wore a belt from which a small piece of cloth or a net was hanging. A few wore cloaks that reached down to the knees. The fabric was similar to Tahitian bark cloth, but sewn with twine to make it more durable. It was usually dyed yellow with turmeric. The islanders allowed the group to go ashore undisturbed. They remained calm and showed no signs of hostility. On the contrary, they seemed afraid of the strangers' firearms, clearly aware of their deadly effect. Most were unarmed, but a few carried lances or spears. These were made from rough, knotted wood and tipped with sharp, triangular pieces of black volcanic glass. One of them had a club made from a thick piece of wood, about 90 centimeters long, with carvings on one end. Two others held short wooden weapons that resembled the patu of New Zealand, traditionally made from fishbone.
The patu used by the Maori of New Zealand in the 18th century was a short, flat club designed for close combat. Typically made from hardwood, whalebone, or the prized greenstone bonamu. It had a broad striking surface and a rounded handle with a hole for a wrist cord. This cord ensured the weapon stayed in the warrior's hand during a fight. In battle, the patu-patu was used with swift, precise blows aimed at the head or upper body, capable of delivering fatal strikes by crushing the skull or breaking bones. Its compact size made it effective in the close quarters fighting that often occurred during hand-to-hand encounters. Beyond its practical use, the patu-patu held cultural significance. Owning a finely crafted greenstone version was a mark of status and mana, prestige, within Maori society. Such weapons could be passed down through generations as treasured heirlooms, carrying the history and honor of their previous owners.
Some wore unusual items such as a European hat or a similar type of cap. One man had a striped cotton handkerchief, another wore a torn blue woolen jacket. These objects were remnants from the Spanish presence in 1770. Altogether, the appearance of the islanders suggested that their land must be very poor. They were shorter than the people of New Zealand or the Society and Friendly Islands. There was not one among them who could be called tall. They were thin and had narrower faces than other inhabitants of the South Pacific. Their lack of clothing and eagerness for the visitors' goods without offering anything in return were clear signs of their poverty. Their bodies were heavily tattooed, especially the faces. The women, who were small and delicately built, also bore facial tattoos. These resembled the beauty marks worn by European ladies. Among the assembled crowd, however, there were no more than 10 to 12 women. The women seemed discontent with their light brown skin. They painted their faces additionally with reddish-brown pigment and layered it with the bright orange-red of turmeric root. Some had also decorated their faces with white lines made from powdered seashells. The art of facial decoration was clearly not limited to European women imitating French fashion. The women of Easter Island wore clothing, but it was so minimal that it stood in sharp contrast to the elaborate and complete garments worn in Tahiti. Men and women alike had lean facial features, though they did not appear savage. The intense sun, which offered little shade in this barren land, had distorted some of their faces. Their eyebrows were tightly drawn together and the muscles in the lower face pushed upward toward the eyes. Their noses were not broad, but flat between the eyes. Their lips were full, but not as thick as those of African descent. Their black hair was curly but cut short everywhere, never longer than 7 centimeters. Their eyes were dark brown and small, with the whites of the eyes less clear than in other South Pacific peoples. Their long earlobes and unusually large holes had already been noted. To stretch the openings further, they inserted rolled-up sugarcane leaves, which, thanks to their elasticity, kept the cuts constantly distended. The unbearable heat of the sun, with hardly any natural shade on the island, had led them to develop various forms of headwear. Some men wore a 5-centimeter thick ring of tightly braided grass around the head, adorned with long black feathers from the throat of the frigatebird. Others wore large, bushy caps made from brown gull feathers as thick as the great wigs of the 18th century. Still others had simple wooden hoops on their heads from which long white feathers of the tropicbird dangled. These swayed with even the slightest breeze, shielding the head from the sun while keeping it cool at the same time. The women wore wide hats made from intricately woven matting. The women's hats came to a point at the front. The head cavity was not round and flat-topped like European hats, but elongated, narrowing upward from both sides at an angle. At the back, 2 separate flaps hung down, presumably to protect the shoulders. These hats were found to be extremely cooling. Mr. Hodges sketched a woman wearing such a hat and a man with one of the described headdresses. Both depictions were highly distinctive and were later engraved in copper. The only ornaments found among these people were the tongue-shaped bone pieces worn on the chest by both men and women. Additionally, they observed necklaces and earrings made from seashells. After spending some time on the beach with the islanders, they moved farther inland. The ground was strewn with rocks and stones of various sizes, all with a black, burnt and porous surface, indicating they had been exposed to intense heat. 2 or 3 types of grass grew sparsely between the stones. Although the grass was already half dried, it somewhat softened the impression of a desolate and devastated landscape. About 15 meters from the landing site, they came upon a wall made of rectangular, hewn stones. Each stone was approximately 45 to 60 centimeters long and 30 centimeters wide. The wall stood about 2 to 2.4 meters high in the middle, but was lower at the ends. Its total length was around 6 meters. The most remarkable feature was the craftsmanship. The stones had been laid with such precision and fit together so tightly that the result was an extremely stable structure. The stone used was a black-brown, porous, and brittle type of lava rock. The ground sloped upward from the coast, so that a second wall, running parallel to the first and situated 3.5 meters higher, needed to be only 60 to 90 centimeters tall to form a kind of terrace between them. This terrace was covered with a flat, grassy surface. About 15 meters farther south, they found another elevated area. It was paved with the same rectangular stones used for the wall. At the center of this platform stood a stone column carved from a single piece. It was 6 meters tall and 1.5 meters thick, clearly intended to represent a human figure up to the waist. The figure was poorly executed and showed that the art of sculpture on the island was still in its early stages. Eyes, nose, and mouth were barely indicated on the clumsy, misshapen head. The ears, however, in keeping with local custom, were extraordinarily long and more carefully carved than the rest. A European artist would have been ashamed of such a result. The neck was short and ill-formed, the shoulders and arms only roughly outlined. Atop the head sat a tall, round, cylindrical stone. It had both a diameter and height of approximately 1.5 meters. The addition resembled the headwear of certain Egyptian deities. It was made from a different type of stone and had a reddish color. On both sides, there were holes suggesting the round shape had been created by grinding or turning. The head, with its crown-like top, made up half of the visible pillar. Yet there was no indication that the islanders offered these columns, pillars, or statues any form of religious worship. Still, they appeared to show a certain respect. At times, it was visibly uncomfortable for them when the visitors walked across the paved platform or stepped on the base to examine the type of stone from which these works had been made. Some locals accompanied them further inland to a small thicket where they hoped to discover something new in the plant world. The path was extremely difficult, leading over volcanic stones that rolled away under their feet with every step. They constantly bumped into them. The locals, used to such terrain, leapt effortlessly from stone to stone. On the way, they saw a few black rats which are found on all the islands of the South Pacific. The thicket they were heading toward consisted of a small plantation of paper mulberry trees. Their bark, as on Tahiti, was used here for making clothing. The tree trunks stood between 60 and 120 centimeters tall, growing in neat rows between large boulders. In those places, rain had washed in a bit of soil, allowing the trees to grow. Not far from there, they discovered several bushes of Hibiscus populneus found on all the islands of the South Seas. The locals used it to dye fabrics yellow. There also grew a type of mimosa, which provided the only wood the inhabitants used for their clubs, patu patus, and makeshift canoes. The farther inland they went, the barer and more barren the ground became. The small group of residents who had welcomed them at the landing place seemed to be the main tribe of the entire population. Along the way, they encountered not a single person. Even in the wide area they could see, they counted no more than 10 to 12 huts. One of the most impressive huts stood on a small hill about 900 meters from the coast. Curious, they made their way there, only to find it a miserable structure that spoke of the poverty of its inhabitants. Its foundation consisted of stones about 3.6 meters long, lying flat on the ground in two curved lines. At the point of greatest curvature, the two rows were about 1.8 meters apart, but at the outer ends, barely 30 centimeters. Each of these stones had one or two holes in which poles were inserted. The central poles were about 1.8 meters high, the side ones progressively shorter until the last were only 60 centimeters tall. At the top, the poles leaned toward each other and were connected by cross pieces that held them together. The roof was made of thin rods woven in a zigzag pattern, covered on the outside with a thick mat of sugarcane leaves. It reached all the way to the ground and came together at the top in a sharp angle. On one side was an opening about 45 to 60 centimeters high, sheltered from the rain by an overhanging roof. This served as the entrance. Anyone wishing to go in or out had to crawl on all fours. They tried it, but the effort wasn't worth it. The interior was completely empty and bare, not even a bundle of straw to lie on. Only in the middle was it possible to stand upright. Inside, it was dark and uncomfortable. Their native companions told them that they spent the nights in these huts. But it must have been a wretched stay. Given the small number of huts, the inhabitants must have been crammed together to find space. It was likely that the common people often slept under the open sky, leaving these poor shelters to the higher-ranking individuals. Perhaps they only sought refuge in them during bad weather. Next to the huts, they also found several piles of stones. On one side, they were steep with an opening that led underground. The interior space seemed very small, but it was reasonable to think these holes also served as shelters at night. Perhaps they were connected to natural underground caves, such as those often found in volcanic regions with old lava flows. Such caves can also be found in Iceland, where it is known that former inhabitants used them as refuge. Herr Ferber, a mineralogical historian of Vesuvius, also reported that he had discovered a similar cave in one of the more recent lava flows. The group would have liked to explore these caves in more detail, but the locals never let them inside. Next to the hut, they discovered a sugarcane and banana plantation laid out in fairly good order as far as the stony soil allowed. Around each banana plant was a depression about 30 centimeters deep, presumably intended to collect rainwater so the plants could be better supplied with moisture. The sugarcane, despite the dry ground, grew up to 3 meters high and contained a very sweet juice which the locals often offered them, especially when they mentioned being thirsty. This led them to suspect that the island might have no fresh water. However, when they returned to the landing place, they found Captain Cook at a well the locals had shown him. The well lay not far from the shore, cut deep into the rock but full of debris. Once the crew had cleaned it, the water turned out to be slightly brackish. Nevertheless, the locals drank it with great pleasure. The captain had little success in trading with the inhabitants. they seemed to have hardly any surplus food. All he could obtain for iron goods and Tahitian cloth were a few baskets of sweet potatoes, some sugar cane, a few bunches of bananas, and 2 or 3 small, already cooked chickens. The glass beads he gave them were tossed aside in disdain. Instead, they demanded anything they saw among the strangers, offering nothing in return. During the group's absence, the locals had wandered far from the landing place, likely having gone back to their huts for their midday meal. The number of women remained small compared to the men. Upon arrival, they had seen no more than 12 to 15 women. Now only 6 or 7 were present. These women showed neither reserve nor modesty. For a piece of Tahitian cloth, they gave the sailors anything they wished. Their facial features were gentle, yet the tall pointed hat gave them a frivolous, almost coquettish appearance. Before noon the group returned on board. The purchased fruits, roots, and plants were distributed among the crew to strengthen the sick, who were in urgent need of fresh provisions. The chickens were also tried. They had been wrapped in green leaves and cooked underground with hot stones, a method of preparation widespread throughout the South Seas. The sweet potatoes were golden yellow and tasted as sweet as yellow carrots, which did not appeal to everyone. Still, they were nourishing and very helpful against scurvy. The plant's juice seemed to be extremely concentrated due to the heat and dryness of the soil. The bananas were considered excellent, and the sugar cane was even sweeter than what they had encountered on Tahiti. In the afternoon, they went ashore again. Another boat brought an officer and crew to the well to fill the water casks. At the landing place, they met only a few people. Among them stood out a man who appeared to hold some authority. He seemed eager to accompany the captain wherever he showed interest. Unlike his countrymen, this man was not shy. He walked boldly beside them while the others recoiled in fear at the slightest unfamiliar movement. Despite their timidity, the locals were skilled at stealing from the visitors' pockets, taking whatever they fancied. Barely half an hour after landing, one local crept quietly up behind Moai, snatched his black cap from his head in a flash, and dashed away over the rough, stony ground. None of them could chase him down. Moai was so startled that it took him some time to find the words to report the theft to the captain, but by then the thief was long gone. At the same time, Mr. Hodges was sitting on a small rise, sketching a landscape, when he too lost his hat in a similar way. Mr. Wales stood beside him with a musket, but considered it inappropriate to waste a bullet over such a small offense. As they walked along the seashore, they discovered several celery plants, the same variety often found along the beaches of New Zealand. They also came across a few small plants they had seen there before. Whether these herbs were native to the island or had grown from seeds washed ashore by the sea or brought by birds, they could not tell. They also came upon a small plot of land planted with yams, which in their eyes greatly enriched the sparse flora of Easter Island. The similarities in facial features, customs, and language between the inhabitants of this island and those of other South Sea islands made them hope to find here the same domestic animals they had seen on Tahiti and New Zealand. But despite careful searching, they found nothing except the common chicken. These chickens were very small in stature and had an unremarkable plumage. They also noted 2 or 3 black terns, so tame that they perched on the locals' shoulders. Still, they could not conclude that there was any organized breeding of these birds. At sunset, they left the water source and made their way back to the bay where their boat lay at anchor. On the way, they crossed the spot where the previously described column stood. Some locals who accompanied them indicated that they should walk on the grass at the base of the pedestal rather than on the masonry. When they ignored this, the locals reacted without displeasure. They asked the most knowledgeable locals what these stones meant. From their answer, they concluded that they must be monuments to their eriki, or kings. The masonry pedestal likely served as a burial place. This assumption was confirmed when they found many human bones nearby. The length of the bones matched bodies of medium height. One measured femur corresponded exactly to that of a person about 1.75 meters tall. On the west side of the bay stood 3 columns in a row on a broad raised platform. The locals called this row Hanga Roa. The single column mentioned earlier they called Obina. Near the pillars, 10 to 12 locals sat around a small fire, roasting a few potatoes for their evening meal. As the group passed by, the locals offered them some. Such hospitality surprised them in so poor a land. They compared this behavior with the customs of so-called civilized nations, which often seemed far removed from any true empathy for their fellow human beings. It was also pleasing to see that the Dutch assumption that such fires had a religious significance was unfounded. They found no indication that the fires were part of any ceremony. With a small supply of potatoes they had purchased and 6 or 7 plants they had gathered, they finally returned on board. The walk had done the sailors suffering from scurvy an extraordinary amount of good. George, whose legs had still been swollen in the morning, already felt much better by evening. The swelling had gone down, and the pain had completely disappeared. He attributed this rapid improvement solely to the exercise. Perhaps, too, the anti-scorbutic vapors of the land had played a part, for it was said that these alone were enough to restore to health sailors afflicted with scurvy.
That brings us to the end of episode 37 of Georg Foster's journey around the world about the HMS Resolution under the command of Captain James Cook. A map with the key locations of this episode is linked in the show notes. If you'd like to see how these places look today, visit my YouTube channel Voyage to Go, where I trace Foster's path and explore the echoes of history in the present day. Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next part of our expedition. If you enjoy the podcast and want to support my work, you'll find the PayPal link in the show notes. The journey continues, and I'd love to have you along for the next chapter, because life is a journey, being part of it is everything.